What if I told you that beneath Miami's glittering skyline lies a history older than the United States itself, one carved in swamps, hurricanes, and wars? What if the beaches that attract millions of tourists every year were once battlegrounds for survival, where ancient peoples fought to protect their way of life, and European empires clashed for control of this humid frontier? Miami wasn't always palm trees, nightclubs, and luxury towers. For thousands of years, it was a harsh and unforgiving land, a place many thought uninhabitable. And yet, it became one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the modern world. How did this swamp transform into a global city? That journey begins far earlier than most realize. To understand Miami today, we need to rewind, not just a few centuries, but thousands of years. Long before highways, airports, and cruise ships, this land was wild, waterlogged, and full of danger. Yet people called it home. They thrived here, developing cultures perfectly adapted to the wetlands. And then came outsiders. Spanish conquistadors, British forces, and finally Americans, each leaving scars, battles, and legacies that shaped Miami's destiny. The city's rise is not just a story of growth, but a story of survival. Survival against disease, invasion, and nature itself. But here's the twist. Miami almost never existed at all. The first known people to settle the area we now call Miami were the Tequesta. Archaeological evidence shows their presence in South Florida for at least 2,000 years, possibly longer. They lived along the Miami River, Biscayne Bay, and deep into the Everglades. The Tequesta were not farmers in the traditional sense. Unlike the great agricultural civilizations of the Americas, they relied heavily on the environment around them. Their food came from the sea, the river, and the forests. Fish, shellfish, turtles, deer, and plants. They built dugout canoes that carried them through the maze of mangroves and waterways. Their villages were made of thatched huts, raised slightly to protect from flooding. Burial mounds and ceremonial sites have been uncovered around modern-day Miami downtown, including the famous Miami Circle, a mysterious ring of 24 carved holes in limestone bedrock discovered in 1998. Archaeologists believe it was part of a ceremonial or residential structure, possibly dating back 2,000 years, proof of a complex and enduring society. But here's a haunting fact. When Europeans arrived, the Tequesta numbered only a few hundred to a few thousand. By the 18th century, disease, war, and forced relocation had nearly erased them. Their entire culture, which had thrived for centuries in the swampland, would vanish almost completely, leaving behind only artifacts and traces beneath the city skyscrapers. So the first question we must ask is this: if the land was so harsh, why did people fight so hard to stay here? In 1513, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon sailed to Florida. His arrival marked the first recorded European contact with the Tequesta. Ponce de Leon likely anchored near Biscayne Bay, drawn to its clear waters and lush coasts. But his arrival was anything but peaceful. The Spanish wanted land, gold, and converts. The Tequesta wanted none of it. While some initial exchanges occurred, tensions quickly escalated. The Spanish attempted to establish missions in South Florida during the 1560s and again in the 1740s, but each attempt failed. Why? The Tequesta resisted foreign domination, and the environment itself, mosquitoes, heat, and hurricanes, defeated European settlers again and again. Yet Spain claimed Florida as part of its empire. For centuries, Miami remained a distant, dangerous frontier, too difficult to colonize, but too important to ignore. And here's the twist. While Spain struggled, another European power had its eyes on Florida's southern tip. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, Spain ceded Florida to Britain. For the first time, Miami came under British control. The British saw potential in the land. Pineapples, sugarcane, and other crops could thrive here. They attempted to bring settlers. But there was one massive obstacle: the Seminoles. By the 18th century, the Tequesta were nearly gone. In their place, new indigenous groups moved south, most notably the Seminoles, a people formed from Creek Indians who migrated from Georgia and Alabama, joined by escaped African slaves seeking refuge in the Everglades. The Seminoles became fierce defenders of the land. The British period was short-lived, just 20 years. In 1783, after the American Revolution, Florida returned to Spain. But the Seminoles remained, stronger than ever. And they were about to become central players in a violent struggle that would define Miami's early story. When the United States acquired Florida from Spain in 1821, it set the stage for conflict. American settlers wanted the land. The U.S. government wanted to remove the Seminoles, but the Seminoles refused. This sparked the Seminole Wars, some of the longest and bloodiest conflicts between Native peoples and the United States. Miami's swampland became a battleground. Soldiers built Fort Dallas on the Miami River in the 1830s as part of the Second Seminole War. From here, campaigns were launched to chase Seminole fighters deep into the Everglades. The wars were brutal. Guerrilla attacks, ambushes, and scorched earth tactics turned South Florida into chaos. Many Seminoles were killed or forced to relocate west of the Mississippi. Yet some remained, retreating deeper into the Everglades where the U.S. Army could not reach them. Their descendants still live in Florida today. Here's a chilling fact. The Seminole Wars nearly wiped Miami off the map before it was ever born. The land was left desolate, abandoned forts, ruined fields, and scattered survivors. For decades, the Miami area lay quiet again, a ghost of its violent past. In the mid-19th century, a handful of settlers tried again. Families like the Tuttle, Brickell, and Stiltsville pioneers braved the wilderness. Julia Tuttle, in particular, would later become known as the mother of Miami. But in these early decades, the area was still remote, reachable only by boat, plagued by mosquitoes, and far from major trade routes. Sugar plantations were attempted and abandoned. Citrus groves grew, but were vulnerable to storms. The Civil War further destabilized the region, with Confederate blockade runners using Biscayne Bay as a hiding spot. By the 1870s, Miami remained a tiny village. Fewer than 100 people lived along the Miami River. It seemed destined to remain a forgotten outpost. But here's where history twists again. One decision, one act of vision, would transform Miami from a swamp village to a city. In the 1990s, Julia Tuttle owned large tracts of land on the north bank of the Miami River. She believed the area had potential, but no one else did. There was no railroad, no easy way to bring goods or people. Then disaster struck Central Florida. In 1894-95, a great freeze destroyed crops across the state. But in Miami, the tropical climate spared it. Tuttle saw her chance. She convinced railroad magnate Henry Flagler, who had already built rail lines down the Florida coast, to extend his railroad to Miami. She sweetened the deal by offering him land. It worked. In 1896, the Florida East Coast Railway reached Miami. That same year, the city was officially incorporated. Think about this. Without Julia Tuttle's gamble, Miami might still be a swampy village. She turned a near-forgotten wilderness into the foundation of one of America's fastest-growing cities. Miami in the 1920s was the magic city, growing so fast that it seemed untouchable. But what happens when a dream grows faster than reality can hold it? Miami was about to find out. In less than a decade, the city would go from boomtown to near ruin, slammed by hurricanes, crushed by economic collapse, and forced to fight for survival once again. Miami was officially incorporated in 1896. By the early 1900s, it was still young, still untested. The railroad had opened the gates to settlers, farmers, and businessmen, but the real transformation came in the Roaring '20s. The nation was booming. Cars, radios, jazz, and a new kind of leisure culture were sweeping across America. And Miami was perfectly positioned to become the escape, a tropical playground where winter never came. Developers saw gold in the sand. Advertisements promised paradise, fortunes, and a chance to own a piece of the future. Within just a few years, Miami would become one of the most talked about cities in America. But here's the twist. The same forces that built it almost destroyed it. By the 1910s, Miami's population had already doubled several times over. Wealthy Northerners began visiting in winter, lured by the warm climate and the luxury hotels built by Henry Flagler and others. Tourism was growing, but it was just the beginning. The real explosion came in the 20s. Miami became the centerpiece of Florida's infamous land boom. Advertisements ran in newspapers across the country. Postcards of palm trees, sparkling water, and wide boulevards promised newcomers that Miami was a paradise waiting for them. Speculation went wild. Land that once had been swamp or scrub was suddenly sold for fortunes. People bought lots they had never seen, often flipping them days later for double or triple the price. Developers drained marshes, carved new streets, and promised entire neighborhoods. Here's a shocking fact. At the peak of the boom, some parcels of Miami land changed hands 10 times in a single day. By 1925, Miami was at the height of mania. The population had exploded, more than doubling in just 5 years. New buildings, hotels, and neighborhoods rose at breakneck speed. Cars jammed streets built for horses. Newspapers declared Miami the fastest-growing city in the United States. But cracks were already showing. The city's infrastructure couldn't keep up. Roads were clogged, water and electricity stretched thin, and promised developments were sometimes nothing more than empty lots with wooden signs. Still, the fever grew. Celebrities, millionaires, and ordinary workers all wanted in. For many, Miami wasn't just a city, it was a ticket to riches. But here's the pattern interruption. The dream couldn't last. And in September 1926, Miami's luck ran out. On September 18, 1926, a Category 4 hurricane slammed directly into Miami. Winds over 150 miles per hour shredded buildings, tore off roofs, and sent walls of water surging inland. The booming city became a battlefield overnight. The destruction was staggering. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Downtown buildings collapsed. At least 372 people were killed and over 6,000 injured. Thousands were left homeless. For a city barely 3 decades old, it was a crushing blow. The hurricane exposed Miami's vulnerabilities: fragile infrastructure, untested building codes, and a population far larger than the city could truly support. But here's the twist. Many outside Miami didn't hear the full truth right away. Developers and newspapers downplayed the disaster, fearing it would scare away investors. Miami kept selling the dream, but the damage was done. The hurricane was the beginning of the end of the land boom. By 1927, the frenzy of speculation had collapsed. Land values plummeted. Many investors who had bought on credit were ruined. Banks began to fail. Then came the Great Depression in 1929, hitting Miami just as it was trying to recover. Tourism dried up, construction stopped. The once unstoppable Magic City seemed cursed, its dream shattered in less than a decade. By the early 1930s, Miami was struggling to survive. But it wasn't just economics that haunted the city. Another storm was on the way. The Florida Keys, just south of Miami, were devastated by one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the United States, the 1935 Labor Day hurricane, a Category 5 monster with winds over 185 miles per hour. Though Miami avoided the direct hit, the storm was a warning. The region would always live under the shadow of nature's wrath. The devastation of the Keys, including the deaths of hundreds of World War I veterans working on the overseas highway, sent shockwaves through South Florida. Miami survived, but its dreams of easy wealth were gone. So how did Miami endure? Through reinvention. Even in the Depression, Miami had an advantage: climate. People still wanted to escape the cold winters of the North. Tourism became the lifeline again. Developers shifted focus from speculative land sales to entertainment, leisure, and culture. Art Deco hotels began to rise in Miami Beach. Bright pastel colors, geometric lines, and modern designs gave the city a new face. Today, the Art Deco district is one of Miami's most iconic neighborhoods, but it was born in the desperate years of the 1930s, when reinvention was the only option. And then came World War II. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, Miami's location became critical. Its warm climate, open waters, and strategic position near the Caribbean made it a hub for training and defense. The U.S. military flooded into Miami. Hotels were converted into barracks and hospitals. Airfields were built. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen trained along Miami's beaches and skies. The war effort brought money, jobs, and growth back to the city. By the time the war ended in 1945, Miami was transformed. Its population had surged again, fueled by returning veterans who had trained there and wanted to come back with their families. After surviving hurricanes, busts, and wars, Miami thought it had endured everything. But nothing in its young history prepared it for the flood of people, cultures, and conflicts that would arrive in the 1950s and 1960s. Imagine a city where refugees, revolutionaries, and entrepreneurs collided with locals, where streets became theaters of survival and reinvention, and where international politics played out as vividly as local elections. This was the Miami that emerged from the shadow of World War II, a city no longer just a tropical playground, but the crossroads of the Americas.
By 1945, Miami had recovered from the Great Depression and had been revitalized by the war. Its population was growing steadily, driven by veterans and new residents attracted by the tropical climate and economic opportunity. Hotels, shops, and new neighborhoods multiplied. Yet, the seeds of the city's next transformation were already being planted far beyond Florida. In Cuba, an island nation just 90 miles from Miami, political unrest and revolution were simmering. The ripple effects would redefine Miami forever. But before the Cuban Revolution, Miami had already become a laboratory for change, a melting pot of northern retirees, southern transplants, and early Caribbean immigrants. The city was restless, ambitious, and ready to absorb whatever came next. The post-war years saw Miami transitioning from a seasonal resort town to a year-round city. Air conditioning, affordable cars, and better roads made life in South Florida more comfortable and accessible. Suburban development spread rapidly. Neighborhoods like Coconut Grove, Coral Gables, and Miami Beach expanded. Developers continued the work of draining swamps, filling in lowlands, and building roads. The city was no longer a fragile frontier, it was a permanent, growing metropolis. Yet, beneath the glamour and pastel facades, tensions simmered. African-American residents in neighborhoods like Overtown faced segregation, discriminatory housing practices, and limited economic opportunities. Miami's growth was not uniform, it was marked by stark inequality. And here's the twist. These social tensions would intersect dramatically with an influx of immigrants that would soon arrive from the Caribbean, particularly Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista regime in Cuba, establishing a communist government. Overnight, Miami became the primary gateway for Cuban exiles fleeing the island. The first wave of exiles included wealthy businessmen, professionals, and middle-class families who brought skills, capital, and ambition. They arrived with little more than suitcases, but they were determined to rebuild their lives. Miami was a safe haven, a city whose proximity to Cuba made it geographically and psychologically accessible. The impact on Miami was immediate. Little Havana, once a modest neighborhood, quickly transformed into the cultural heart of Cuban Miami. Cafes, restaurants, shops, and political organizations sprouted Cuban culture, politics, and nostalgia. Streets were alive with music, coffee, and the vibrancy of a transplanted homeland. Here's a striking fact. Between 1959 and 1962, over 200,000 Cubans arrived in Miami, almost doubling the city's foreign-born population in just a few years. This was more than migration. It was a demographic earthquake that reshaped the city forever.
Miami's role as a refuge made it a focal point of international politics. U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA, monitored Cuban exiles closely. Plans for invasions, sabotage, and propaganda campaigns, like the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, were coordinated from Miami offices and training camps. The city became a stage for intrigue. Exiles lobbied, protested, and agitated against Castro's government. Newspapers covered every anti-communist rally. Even ordinary residents felt the pressure. Miami was not just a city, it was a front line in the ideological battle of the Cold War. Miami's transformation wasn't just political or demographic, it was deeply social. The influx of Cuban exiles created a city of neighborhoods divided by culture, language, and politics. The city's identity was no longer purely Floridian. It was now Cuban, Caribbean, and international. While Cubans dominated the headlines, Miami became home to immigrants from across the Americas. Haitians arrived, fleeing poverty and dictatorship. Nicaraguans, Colombians, and Dominicans joined the growing mosaic. Each wave brought its own challenges and contributions. Businesses, churches, cultural festivals, and tensions over jobs and housing. By the late 1960s, Miami had become a polyglot city, where Spanish, English, and French Creole were spoken on the streets. Schools, businesses, and politics adapted or struggled to accommodate this rapid change. Yet with diversity came competition and conflict. Political power, economic opportunity, and social space were limited. Tensions between ethnic groups, long-term residents, and newcomers would shape Miami's urban landscape and politics for decades. Parallel to the immigrant influx, Miami's African-American community faced systemic discrimination. Neighborhoods like Overtown were densely populated, underfunded, and segregated. Public services, schools, and hospitals were unequal. The 1960s brought national civil rights movements into Miami. Protests, sit-ins, and marches demanded equality. Yet the city's power structure often resisted change, deepening frustrations. By the late 1960s, Miami was a city of stark contrasts. Growing prosperity and cultural vibrancy existed alongside poverty, segregation, and social unrest. Here's a dramatic fact. Riots broke out in Overtown and Liberty City during the 1960s and early 1970s, signaling that Miami's rapid transformation carried a social cost, and that survival and reinvention would not be limited to geography or weather. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought global attention to Miami. Residents lived with the real fear that a nuclear confrontation could erupt overnight. Civil defense drills, government alerts, and media coverage made the city a frontline in a potential global disaster. This period reinforced Miami's identity as a city at the intersection of local and global forces. The Cold War was not abstract. It was felt on the streets, in the offices, and in the homes of people who had fled Cuba only a few years earlier. Miami became more than a tourist destination. It became geopolitical, a city whose fate was intertwined with the fate of nations. Amid these tensions, Miami's economy evolved. Tourism remained crucial, but banking, real estate, and trade began to dominate. Cuban and other Caribbean exiles brought expertise and capital, establishing businesses that catered not only to the local community, but to international markets. The Port of Miami expanded, becoming a major hub for trade and shipping between the U.S. and Latin America. Airlines began offering direct flights across the Americas, further cementing Miami's role as a gateway city. By the late 1960s, Miami was no longer just a regional city. It was a continental hub, connecting North and South America culturally, economically, and politically. But here's the dark side of Miami's transformation. Alongside legal trade and tourism, the city became a hotspot for smuggling and illicit activity. Proximity to Latin America made it ideal for drug trafficking. By the late 1970s, Miami would become infamous as a hub for cocaine and marijuana importation, a dramatic and violent consequence of its international role. It's a foreshadowing. The Miami of tomorrow would be a city of wealth, glamour, and crime, always at the edge of extremes. Despite challenges, Miami's cultural life thrived. Cuban music, Caribbean rhythms, and Afro-Latin traditions mingled with American pop culture. Nightclubs, theaters, and radio stations reflected this blending. Miami became a city where cultures collided and fused, creating new forms of expression that would influence national and global trends. Art Deco architecture, pastel-colored buildings, and the construction of Miami Beach's hotels during this period preserved a visual identity even as the population and culture evolved dramatically.